Hello, biology students. Today we're going to talk about the process of speciation, which is how new species form. We looked yesterday at the idea of kind of the tree of life, how all living things are related to each other through common ancestors. So today we're going to talk about how those common ancestors, how a single species can separate into different groups that eventually become two completely separate species. We're going to start by watching a short video. This is only about 2.5 minutes that will explain a little bit the story of some salamanders in California. So please click on the link in the note, watch this short video, and answer a couple questions about it that follow. So as you saw in that video, these salamanders moved over many generations south through California, and as they moved, they changed. And if you think about what happened here, so here's my really rough map of California, something like that. The original population was located up here in Northern California. That's where these salamanders started. Over time, animals move, right? A couple salamanders might wander a little bit south during their lifetime, and so now they live a little further south, and the next generation might wander a little farther. So it takes a long, long time, many, many generations. But over time, these salamanders kind of traveled south through California, but they ended up following two different paths. Some of them stayed kind of towards the interior, and some moved down the coast. And they couldn't really go in the middle because it was this really big, dry desert. And salamanders don't do real well when it's dry, and so they couldn't cross this region in the middle. And as they moved down here, random mutations happened within their populations. As mutations always do, they just randomly happened, and some of those mutations affected the coloring of these salamanders. Well, depending on where they were located, those differences in coloring affected their fitness. For the ones that were on the interior side, up here in the mountains, any mutation that changed their color and made them a little more camouflaged in the woods ended up being really beneficial. It helped them kind of hide in the dappled shade of the forest. And so the lizards there over time acquired mutations that made them more and more camouflaged, because the camouflaged lizards were the ones that were best suited to their environment. They survived the most, they reproduced, they passed on those genes. So by the time they got down to the southern part, you had this group of lizards that looked like this one on the right that were very highly camouflaged. The ones on the coast ended up with a different strategy. There were random mutations there, but out here, a black and yellow mutation probably wouldn't be beneficial. The ones that helped them survive along the coast ended up being mutations that happened to change their color so that they looked like these poisonous newts. And so because of that combination of different random mutations and different selective pressures in those two different environments, by the time they got to the south end of the desert, we had these two groups of lizards that looked really different. Some were camouflaged and some were mimics. And as they said in the video, these two are able to interbreed, and they produce these hybrid lizards, but the hybrids aren't very fit anywhere. They're not good camouflage in the forest. They're not good mimics. And so these hybrid ones don't really survive, which means the genes of these two groups aren't really mixing together very much, because when they do, those offspring don't survive very well. So these two have become separate groups that look significantly different and have different adaptations to their environments. They're probably not quite different species yet, but they're definitely on the way, because they're separated and they're going to stay separated in terms of reproduction and mixing their genes. So what does it mean to say that something is actually a separate species? Where do we decide? These salamanders look awfully different. Where do scientists kind of draw that line and say, okay, now they're different enough that we'll actually consider them separate species? Here's the guideline that biologists use in general to define what a species is. And notice this is a guideline. It's not a hard and fast definition, because there are exceptions, but in general, organisms are considered members of the same species if they can and will interbreed with each other, They can have offspring, and their offspring are fertile, which means their offspring can then reproduce and have more offspring. The example you see up here on the screen, when you cross a horse and a donkey, they can interbreed. They can have offspring, and their offspring are called mules. But the interesting thing about mules is mules are sterile. Mules cannot mate with other mules and have offspring. The only way to get a mule is to breed a horse and a donkey. So horses and donkeys are considered separate species because they meet the first couple criteria. They can interbreed, they can have offspring, but since their offspring are not fertile, they don't meet that third criteria, so they're considered separate species. So the way that species form in nature involves a few different steps. First of all, the original population has to be separated into groups that either cannot interbreed or will not interbreed. That's called reproductive isolation, and this can happen a couple different ways. With the salamanders, we saw an example of physical separation. So they were physically reproductively isolated because they were on completely separate sides of the desert and they couldn't cross. So they literally couldn't get to each other. And that divided their population into two groups that then evolved along different paths. But sometimes, and we'll look at an example of this in a second, the reproductive isolation happens because of a behavior. The animals technically could get to each other and interbreed, but for some reason, they don't. It could be because they sing different songs or they have different colors or something like that, that they just kind of choose not to interbreed. The effect is the same. What that does is it separates the population into two distinct gene pools. So if there's a mutation in one group, that mutation might help with the fitness of that group, but it's not going to affect the other group at all. And different mutations will happen in the other group, and so they'll accumulate different mutations and adaptations over time. Once they have been isolated, reproductively isolated, however that happens, then natural selection has to occur. If there's no selection, then those two groups would just stay the same. But in most cases, natural selection happens differently for those two groups. Like the salamanders, they had different selective pressures and different mutations happening. And so that process of natural selection occurred differently in those different environments. Sometimes the mutations that happen and get passed on can change their ability or their willingness to interbreed. And remember, since that's kind of the critical piece to whether they're the same species, if the two species change so much that they either physically can't interbreed anymore or they won't because they just don't recognize each other as the same species anymore, or if they can interbreed but their offspring aren't fertile, then they are no longer considered considered the same species. Let's look at a couple examples of this. So here's an example of an organism that was physically reproductively isolated by geography. So many, many years ago, before the Grand Canyon formed, there was one species of squirrel that lived in this area. But over time, as this canyon was carved out by the river and got deeper and deeper, you can imagine if you are a little ground squirrel like these guys, it's really hard to get from one side of the Grand Canyon to the other, right? So over time, they became geographically isolated. They were physically separated by this canyon and couldn't cross. Once they were isolated, the squirrels on this side just mated with squirrels on this side. The squirrels on this side just mated with squirrels on this side. So natural selection started to happen a little bit differently in those two groups. And over time, they developed into completely separate species. On the south side of the Grand Canyon, you have this species called Harris's antelope squirrel. And on the north side, you have one called the white-tailed antelope squirrel. They look very similar to us, but remember, if they can't or won't interbreed with each other and have offspring that are fertile, they are considered separate species. So these two have reached that point where they will no longer interbreed with each other and they are considered separate species. Here's an example of how that reproductive isolation can happen because of a behavior. These little flies are called apple maggot flies. And they've lived in North America for a long time, and originally they fed on these fruits called hawthorns. Hawthorn trees are native to North America. They've been here pretty much forever. But a couple hundred years ago, settlers brought in this other tree called an apple tree. You can see its fruits are fairly similar to hawthorns. And some of the maggot flies landed on apples and said, hey, we can eat these too. But the thing is, these flies are so small that they tend to stay in the tree where they hatch. They feed off of those fruits and they tend to mate with the other flies that are eating the same fruit in the same tree. And so, because of those different behaviors, they could technically fly over to the tree next door and mate with a different fly, but they just don't. They tend to stay in their tree. And so, the apple eating flies, these are the apples, and the hawthorn eating flies became reproductively isolated. And they started to have mutations that made them a little bit different and a little more fit for that tree. Apples and hawthorns don't ripen at exactly the same time. And if fruit fly or if these maggot flies have a mutation that allows them to hatch right around the time that the fruit is ripening in their tree, that's going to help them survive. So they start accumulating mutations that make them better suited to their particular tree. And over time, they reach the point where they can no longer interbreed and they become separate species. You're going to be looking at a few more examples of this process of speciation over the next couple days. Starting with your homework for today, you have a Google form to go and fill out that will give you some practice looking at the different types of natural selection you learned yesterday and this process of speciation. Please contact your teacher if you have any questions, and have a great rest of your day.